Here live being out. Got one more group just showed up in the parking lot.
Okay, you're on there.
Hi.
What you on?
It's 6 o'clock too.
You said just like.
Be where it was at, and then once it goes to something else.
Summer's here.
All the time.
Summer's here, the time is right for dancing in the street. You know, you can't dance in a dance hall now, because you gotta do the mask. Oregonian committee.
Alrighty, here we go. There's a land that is fairer than day, and by faith we can see it afar. For the Father waits over the way to prepare us a dwelling place there. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. We shall sing on that beautiful shore the melodious song of the blessed, and our spirits shall sorrow no more. Not a sigh for the blessings of rest in the sweet by and by. We shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. To our bountiful Father above, we will offer our tribute of praise for the glorious gift of His love, and the blessings that hallow our days. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore. In the sweet by and by, we shall meet on that beautiful shore.
Well, maybe you suppose you could trim those bushes up there a little
We can move those, yes, sir.
bit. You know, it's pretty. Heights.
The microphone wasn't in your right.
Well, that was too. I can't see the last couple of notes. I forgot. So I heard.
Run the spatula through the dishwasher too.
Let's go ahead and have a prayer. God in heaven, we thank you once again for all the many blessings that you've given us. We appreciate the fact that we're able to come here together and enjoy one another's company. We continue to have many that are unable to be here, and we ask your continued watch care over for them and continue to bless them. Please be with Rick so he can have a remembrance of the things he has prepared for this evening. We ask all this in Jesus' name. Amen.
We are in Genesis 13 this evening, and Sherry has said good evening. I didn't get a reminder out again this week, so Bud told me that they were watching. I guess just not always on Wednesday evening, so glad to have whomever and whenever. Okay, Genesis chapter 13. I have my notes in my pocket, but I guess they fell out. Let's look at verses 1 through 7 at first, and then we will discuss them before we move on. It's a one story. All 18 verses contain one narrative, so it's a little bit perhaps unfair to break it up like this. But Genesis chapter 13, beginning in verse 1. So Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev, he and his wife and all that belonged to him, and Lot with him. Now Abram was very rich in livestock, in silver, and in gold. He went on his journeys from the Negev as far as Bethel, to the place where his tent had been at the beginning, between Bethel and Ai, to the place of the altar which he had made there formerly, and there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who went with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents. The land could not sustain them while dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to remain together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abram's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. Now the Canaanite and the Perizzite were dwelling in the land. Okay. So what do we think about the opening here to Genesis chapter 13?
Well, the first thing you think of when you see and read is that both Abraham and Lot left Egypt with large quantity of herds, which were basically the wealth of those early people, along with silver and gold was also part of the wealth. It kind of amazes me that he not only came out with livestock, but he also came out with silver and gold. So it was payment for some reason while he was in Egypt.
I don't know if we made this point real clearly last week, but in the parallel between Abram, if I call him Abraham, he's still Abram at this point, but I kind of go back and forth. The parallel between Abram's journey into Egypt and the nation of Israel through the family of Jacob and the time they're there, and then ultimately the Exodus. One of the parallels is that as Abram comes out blessed and wealthy because of something God lays his hand on Pharaoh, well, that's kind of what happens to Israel on their way out of Egypt. Sometimes we forget that. We think of Israel leaving Egypt as fleeing runaway slaves, and in a sense they are, but the people of Egypt hand over their wealth to Israel on their way out. The scripture says Israel plundered Egypt. They took the wealth of the greatest empire out on their way as they departed. And you can see why, if your children were being killed by the presence of these people, you wouldn't just ask them to leave. You would tell them to leave, and you would give them every resource you could to facilitate their imminent departure. And it's not like, well, I'll leave, but it's an extra $50 to change my flight and leave today. Well, here's the $50, and here's 500 more. Leave. So you don't have anything. If they don't leave, because everyone's being touched by the plagues, and especially the plague of death at the end. So they're all more than happy to see Israel go. Only one person wants them back. The problem is that person is the one who makes all the decisions, and that's Pharaoh. So he's the one who sends his army. But otherwise, everybody else is glad to see him go. Likewise, Abram and Lot leave Egypt, not just with whatever they had, and they were probably pretty wealthy when they went in. They were incredibly wealthy coming out. And here they are back home with all this stuff. Now we got all this stuff.
Had too much stuff for the land they were on, obviously. Which caused consternation between the two families. I'm sure there was some problems with the locals too.
Oh, that's their dwelling. It mentions that, and it doesn't really go into any difficulties at this point with the locals. But it's not like the land is not occupied. We talked about that last week. This land God is promising. Maybe it was 2 weeks ago. The land God promises. He hasn't promised a specific land. He's about to Abram, but that land is occupied by others. It's pretty hard to go anywhere in the world right now and find land that's not occupied by somebody else. There's a saying in real estate, buy land because God isn't making any more of it. You go to Hawaii, he is making more of it though, isn't he? They would say Pele, their goddess, is making, or whoever it is, but the volcanoes are coming up. The big island of Hawaii is expanding. So that's not a wholly accurate statement. We're probably losing more land around the world through erosion, though, than we're gaining there in Hawaii and probably some other spots. So I don't know that we're getting a net gain or anything out of that. But land is an important concept. Place is important. It's important that this is our land, but just if you're going to be the father of a nation, you have to have land. You cannot have a great nation and have no land. And we see this coming up already, and this is around the land. This is the land Abram was already beforehand. He's returned back to where he first erected the altar and called on the name of the Lord. He's come back to that place, and that land cannot support all of the livestock. I mean, you have pets, you have to keep up with the food, don't you? That cat or dog, they want to eat every day, don't they? They're kind of like husbands. They want to eat pretty much every day. So you have to take care of that. Well, livestock, it's the same thing. In fact, in a sense, it's even more important because that's your wealth. That's how you measure your wealth. It's not just an animal that you like or maybe one you take for food, but this is our wealth. This is what we buy and sell things with. This is how we take care of all of our needs, and this is how our wealth is measured. So our wealth, Abram's wealth, Lot's wealth, makes demands upon them. They can't just own. How hard is it just to have something? Even now, you buy a car, you pay tax on the money you earned to buy the car with. You pay tax when you buy the car. And I know you Oregonians have it really good on this front, but us Washingtonians pay mightily every year for just owning that car, don't we? When we get our new tags, and we pass constitutional amendments to limit that, and they find ways around, that. So that's how Washington does it. So, but even Oregon, you got to pay something every 2 years, I guess it is. But so wealth drains us in a sense, doesn't it? It's not just something that sustains us. It's not something. In reality, all humans need some level of wealth, don't they? They need something to feed themselves, to clothe themselves, to house themselves. They need something, but That wealth takes from you too. And the wealth that Abram and Lot have at this point creates something called scarcity. The wealth means there's not enough. Well, if I've got money, then I'll always have enough. If I have enough money, I'll have enough of everything else I need. And wealth can create its own level, its own forms of scarcity. You may think, well, that's the kind of scarcity I'd like to wrestle with rather than the scarcity of wealth. Maybe so. But it creates disharmony, doesn't it? It creates stress, it creates tension. These are people that are all supposed to be in it together. I mean, if you're Lot's herdsman, that's Abram's cattle over there. I mean, Abram, it's kind of all one thing in a sense, isn't it? But in a sense, it's not. You're responsible for getting your cattle fed and watered. And they're responsible for getting their cattle fed and watered. And if your cattle don't get fed and watered, they're not going to pay for it, you are. So this wealth creates scarcity. And we can judge these people to some extent. I think if you know much about Lot, I don't know a lot. I wasn't a farm boy or anything like that, but I was raised by the daughter of a farmer, and I was raised by a man whose job was in agriculture. And I have kind of a sympathetic disposition towards the farmers. And when you know their demands, you know the stress that's on them. Those animals have to eat every day. They have to drink every day. They have to have their needs met every day. And wealth creates scarcity. It creates stress through the scarcity. And how do you handle that stress? How do you handle your perception of scarcity? Have we had anything in this country recently where we perceived scarcity?
Yes.
What was it, Mark?
Toilet paper. As well as quite a few other things, actually. There's scarcity of meat, there's certain cuts of meat. There's scarcity as one who uses frozen dinners to make dinner easily. There's a scarcity of a good variety of frozen dinners. I'm found.
Yeah.
But there, in the food category, there's certainly some scarcity as well as some things that, it's amazing that you talk about scarcity, but people hoarded things they thought would be scarce, and which caused a lot of problems. I mean, you go to the grocery store now and you'll find a few boxes of Kleenex and maybe a package of toilet paper to get there early or not.
It's persisted, isn't it?
It is, really.
This respiratory pandemic has made a run on items that have nothing to do with the respiration of human beings. At least not normally, I guess. But the hoarding is the concept there. This idea that whenever we perceive there's going to be scarcity, we hoard. We go out and amass as much as we can, because that thing, I mean, if I had told you a year ago that you're going to have a hard time acquiring toilet paper, you would have thought I was crazy. I mean, it's everywhere and it's relatively inexpensive. It's one of the cheapest things we have. And I don't know if the price went through the roof on it or not. I got to say that I guess it's just the two of us or whatever. It hasn't been a big imposition on us. We've been, I guess you could say, blessed in that regard. But it doesn't matter how much money you have if there's none in the store, is there?
Yep, it makes a difference.
So how do we respond? Well, we hoard. We drive to a different town hoping we can find it. Mike told me right kind of at the height of all that and said, Rick, they got a bunch of it up at Costco in Lewiston or Clarkston. You want to drive a 4 or 4.5 hour round trip to buy toilet paper? And ultimately I did, because I couldn't find it anywhere else. I still haven't even torn into that Costco package yet, but I thought I better go get some just in case. And it's starting to, there is a supply seems to be catching up with our insane demand at this point. But Ray, did you have something?
Most of the folks here know I tend to think sometimes outside the box. But what you're talking about is kind of in line with thought I have. Sometimes having all these wonderful things can create a scarcity in faith and trust in God. We tend to think, I have all this stuff, look how good I am, I'm set, and so I think sometimes it kind of limits our dependency on God for the everyday things. Also, when we have these things where, I know not everybody does this, personally, I would feel if I've been blessed with these things, then I feel a responsibility to kind of take care of those things that the Lord has blessed me with. And that's kind of where they're at with their herbs. They're just not going to, well, the fact that they don't have enough water, you got to try to take care of those the best we can.
Mm-hmm. So the scarcity creates, and how do we handle it? What does that look like? What does it look like to be good stewards of the blessings God has given us? And sometimes that means to conserve, to maybe even amass, and then other times it means to just pour out.
I need to share so you don't have the burden of taking care of always just by myself.
I read a lot of crazy books going through my graduate program. Sherry one time looked at my book and said, "They're making you read some really weird stuff." And some of it was weird, but one of it was a book about how to authentically, I think, do the commandments of Christ, which is to give to the one who asks. Just be not let the left hand know what the right hand is doing and all of that. And it was this black lady who had grown up very poor, but not totally impoverished. Her dad had a pretty good job by the expectations of the community. Still didn't have a lot of money to spend. And how they blessed each other, and how she got out, made money, and kind of fell into the typical American thing where I'm making money, I'm going to go buy whatever I want, I'm going to have what I want. And then she went out and got a new car, nice new car, and she has it for a while, and someone says, "Can I borrow your car?" And she's like, "Well, I just got this car. It's a nice car." She said, "When I had my old junker car, if somebody wanted to borrow it, I just gave them the keys. I didn't care." And when you have the old junker car, what? Nobody wants to borrow it either. So this wealth becomes kind of a trap. And how does it look? And really, what is scarcity? In this case, you have scarcity of land and water and food. When you fly, it's really a tremendous blessing. We can't do it right now because of the pandemic very often. But when you fly, it's tremendous. I mean, we go across the country, go across the United States, and we're about 5 or 6 hours in a flight. If it's nonstop. Sherry and I flew last year from Seattle to Boston overnight. We get on a plane late night in Seattle, like midnight or something like that. Wake up 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning in Boston, Massachusetts. Overnight. How long did it take our ancestors to go from someplace like Boston, Massachusetts to Seattle? How long? Months. And when they came over, we see them in the covered wagons. The movies always show them riding in the covered wagons. They didn't really ride in the covered wagons. They walked alongside the covered. Why are you going to put your body in that wagon and make that ox pull you? Because he's working hard enough. And if you had oxen, you were lucky. If you had all this stuff. But when we get to the airport and the terminal's crowded, we have this luxurious thing dropped in our lap. We're flying across the country. We're going to travel across the country. What a blessing it is. When you get to the airport and your terminal's crowded, your gate is crowded, all the seats are taken up. What do you start doing? trying to carve out your little niche where you can all sit together, and you can have your carry-on bags with you, and you can keep an eye on the gate, and you can keep an eye on the bathroom and go when there's not a lot. You just start trying to amass something, don't you? And if you, maybe not a problem around here, but in Seattle, you got a really good paying job. You got a nice car to drive to that job in. And you get up and you're surrounded by thousands of other people who have really good paying jobs and nice cars. And they're all trying to get to that same job, their jobs at the same time. And how does that affect? How do we live out of our perception of scarcity? And last week we see Abram's faith fail, right? He's outside of the land. He's fearful, and he lies about who Sarah is. I'm really not going to say Sarai. It'll be Sarah, almost. And he lies about who Sarah is. Here, back in the land, there's this perception of scarcity. Abraham sees it. Everybody knows it. Lot knows it. Everybody knows it. Verse 8, so Abram said to Lot, please let there be no strife between you and me, nor between my herdsmen and your herdsmen, for we are brothers. It is not the whole land before you. Please separate from me. If to the left, then I will go to the right. Or if to the right, then I will go to the left. Lot lifted up his eyes and saw all the valley of the Jordan, that it was well watered everywhere. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt as you go to Zoar. So Lot chose for himself all the valley of Jordan, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled in the cities of the valley and moved his tents as far as Sodom. Now the men of Sodom were wicked exceedingly and sinners against the Lord. And we will keep that in mind. Most of us know at least some of that story, so we know where that's alluding to. We're not there. It's going to be a while before we come back to it. So what do we think about this division of land? Okay, there's some selfishness on the part of Lot. He's looking up, and there's good land, and there's not so good land, or desirable land, and not so desirable land. And lots.
Yeah, Abraham could have said, I'll take this and you take that. Because like she said, he wants it all. But he didn't.
So this is good Abram, right? Last week we saw bad Abram. Sarah's my sister. And later on he says it again and hides behind some kind of technicality or whatever. But he says last week his faith fails him. Here his faith is seen. Here his faith is on display. Last time when his faith fails him, he gets blessed. God redeems it and he gets blessed for it. Here when his faith is strong, it doesn't look like he gets blessed. He gets the poorer land. But if you're Israel and you're reading this story and you're sitting in the middle of your homeland, you might think, our father Abraham chose this land. This is the land God gave him. One thing. Another thing you might think is, why was Abraham so stupid to take the bad land? Why didn't he take the good land?
Wasn't the Lord's idea. But, he did choose. I guess he didn't choose because Lot went one way and he had told him that if he goes one way, I'll go the other. And the other led him to Canaan, which was the land that God promised earlier and then again.
It's, maybe Abram knows Lot so well that he knows if I give Lot the choice, I know which way he's going to go. And if I take it, he's going to resent me anyway. Maybe that's there, but that's kind of reading it into the story when it's not really that given to us. But what is clear is that Abram is willing to live sacrificially. He's willing to yield to Lot. And that is what one form of living out of scarcity looks like. To live sacrificially. How would the traffic problem, I've talked to Sherry about this to the point where she's sick of hearing about it, but how would the traffic in Seattle look if everybody drove safe, sound, and courteously? Safely, soundly, and courteously every morning. I think it would transform the commuting experience for everybody else. But because we feel like we're going to get stuck in traffic because someone's going to have a wreck or there's going to be some kind of problem, people drive crazy, they drive aggressive, and they don't ever quit. They don't quit when they're just going, they don't just do it when they're going to get to work in the morning. They do it all the time. And it creates more traffic and more problems. Now, it's not saying I always drive safely, courteously, soundly. I don't always do it either. But how would it transform that? How would our lives transform ourselves? What would our lives look like differently if we did what Abraham did here?
Well, basically, we would acquiesce our desires for the better good for whoever we're working with or talking to or associated with. It's in my mind, I always admired people that were willing to do whatever somebody else asked them to do. Without question. Yep, I can come help you do this, or I can help you do that, or whatever. And never give it a second thought. That's just what they do.
Mm-hmm.
And this is basically Abraham's thought. I think he's willing to do whatever it takes to solve the problem they were faced, and which they did for a while anyway. But I quit. That's it.
Okay, very good. So,
Said there was no need to argue.
no need to argue. That's correct.
Well, arguing could be kind of fun.
In the argument.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you can win the battle and lose the war, can't you? You can, certainly in a relationship, as husbands and wives find out, you can win the fight and lose big time. You are the loser after you won that fight. And that's true in all relationships. But certainly, maybe most easily understood how you win and lose at the same time is snatching defeat from the jaws of victory is something that happens a lot in marriage, I think. So, but we see really what Lot does here. He is selfish, I think. But really what he is doing, and this sets up really the constant divide going forward. And that is, do we go after the ways of the flesh, or do we go after the promise of God? Do we trust in the flesh, or do we trust in the promise? Are we people of flesh, or are we people of faith? And when I say flesh, when we say it, and maybe when you've heard it preached and everything, and maybe when I preach it a lot of times, we associate only bad things with the flesh. And I think in Genesis, in this context, we'll see it come up in other times. It's not so much that the flesh is bad. It's that it's not the promise of God. And sometimes the flesh is more desirable. We're going to look at it later on when God tells Abram the destinies of Ishmael against the destinies of Isaac. Isaac's descendants are going to be slaves. He tells them they're going to be slaves. Ishmael's are going to be mighty and powerful and numerous, all this good stuff. There's really no bad stuff associated with Ishmael. So the flesh can be, certainly to the casual observance, and sometimes even a deeper look, more desirable for us, more desirable than the promise. Now, it's hard for us to think that way because for us, the promise is eternal life with God in heaven. So that nothing can beat that promise. Once you buy into that's your promise that you're trusting in, sure, everything else falls short of that. But that really wasn't how the original audience looked at it. They didn't really think about living and dying and going to heaven and celebrating in the presence of the Lord for all eternity. That wasn't really, to them, a good life was a long life, good health, and a lot of kids and comfort. Relatively wealthy, big family, live a long time, and then go sleep with my fathers. That's kind of their goal. And Israel's goal was to dwell in the land, to occupy the land. They had a much more carnal or fleshly top end of things than we do. And there's some good and some bad in that. But this is the kind of the first incident. I guess you could say Egypt was also this thing, but we don't really get the chance to get there. We just see Abram get scared right off the bat. But here it is Lot lifting up his eyes and seeing things the way a normal human being would see them. And I've lived in Texas. I've lived in Central and Southeast Texas. My grandparents used to live out in West Texas. We would go visit them in West Texas around the holidays. If you were raising cattle and you could raise them in either East Texas or West Texas, you would pick East Texas every time. They actually get some rain in East Texas. They have grass and trees in East Texas. That stuff's all really scarce out in West Texas. And they raise some cattle and all that. But West Texas, not a lot going on out there. Until they found something way underground. But it's the eyes of the flesh versus the eyes of faith. And it's not so much in this case, there is foreshadowing of the outcome of Lot's choice, that Lot is pulling himself into a realm of wickedness by this choice. He's going towards Sodom. He's going towards Hollywood. And there's wonderful Christians that live in Hollywood, California, I'm sure. I know there are wonderful Christians that live in Las Vegas, Nevada. I've preached in Las Vegas probably half a dozen times. There are wonderful people of faith living down there. Whatever you think about Sin City, Lost Wages, or whatever, there are people authentically living out Christian lives down there. And I'm sure they just don't get in the movies, evidently, so we don't see them too much coming out of Hollywood. Maybe that's Lot. The writer of Hebrews talks about righteous Lot. He described him as righteous. And when we get to that story, you're going to be thinking, how in the world is he righteous Lot? Now, I'm not going to have an answer that I may have an answer that makes you even madder when we look at it. But anyway, so we have this foreshadowing, certainly, of the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the fall of Sodom and Gomorrah. We have the selfishness in the sense of Lot, but also just the flesh through Lot lifting up his eyes. Verse 14 now, we'll finish up the chapter, verses 14 through 18. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, now lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward. For all the land which you see, I will give it to you and to your descendants forever. I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if anyone can number the dust of the earth, then your descendants can also be numbered. Arise, walk about the land through its length and breadth, for I will give it to you. Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Lot lifted up his eyes. The Lord lifts up Abram's eyes. Lot journeys, he pitches his tent, he goes. He is still always destined to be a sojourner in this land that he chooses for himself. God doesn't go alongside Lot and say, okay, this is your land, it's going to be yours forever, Lot. your children are going to inherit it, and they're going to have a nation. And Lot is the father of nations. But Lot doesn't get that promise. He doesn't get that guarantee. Abram does. Look around, lift up your eyes, look in every direction, Abram. It's going to be your descendants living here, and they're going to be so thick. You can't swing a dead cat and not hit one. Y'all say that around here, or is that just something we said in Arkansas? Alma's laughing. Do y'all say that down in Louisiana? Do they say swing a dead cat without hitting one? Mississippi, okay. Do they say that down there? Is that just I was told that the phrase "dead pig in the sunshine" was just an Arkansas term. I don't know. Do y'all say that too? Happy as a dead pig in the sunshine? Y'all never heard that? Y'all are sorely lacking in your culture. One of these days, I want to play some Jerry Clower for you. How many people in here know who Jerry Clower is? We got a couple. Last place I was, none of them had ever heard of Jerry Clower. And I thought, you call yourselves Americans. Never heard of Jerry Clower.
I have a funny Jerry Clower story. I was listening to him on the radio going across Southern Idaho on the freeway, tell him to don't. And I got to laughing so hard. And, I happened to look over the car, and right, he's looking at me like, what on earth are you laughing for out here? It's like sagebrush and rock rabbits.
You had to pretend you were on your cell phone, didn't you?
No, I had no cell phone at that time.
Yeah, Jerry predates cell phones a little bit, but
I actually saw him in person one time. He's a funny person.
He was big in the agribusiness. He
Yeah.
had been a fertilizer salesman, and I guess when you sell fertilizer, you get pretty good at what being a comedian is as well.
He sold a lot of fertilizer.
Yeah, I mean, he was really good. Getting back to Abram, where there is no talk of fertilizer, but there is this promise. Lot sojourns in the land, and ultimately things turn out undesirably for him and his family. His wife gets really salty there at the end, doesn't she? That was a bad one. It's never really his land. It's not promised to him. Abraham, it is promised to him, but it's not really his land ever either, is it? He still sojourns in it. It will belong to his descendants. The children play underneath the trees their grandparents planted, that kind of thing. That's not exactly the adage, but one generation benefits from things that other generation. If you're farming now in this area, I don't know what the average size of the wheat farms around here are, but it would be very expensive to just wake up one morning and say, I'm going to become a wheat farmer in this area. The land would be, you can't really make money in farming until you pay off your land, really.
Land is like $2,500 an acre. It takes many acres.
Yeah, so Mark is backing me up. I'm glad he's not contradicting me. But
Never mind.
well, one generation clears the land and plants the land and improves the land, and then subsequent generations hopefully are blessed and are able to be prosperous on the land. So Abraham is walking the land that in a sense it's his, but in a sense it's not his. He doesn't get to really be the owner of the land. It's still just him and his family. It's him surrounded by the Canaanites and the Perizzites. So it is still very much a walk in faith. God does not hand Abraham a deed to the land. Here it is. And God, he makes the inhabitants on the land disappear, and all of a sudden it's all his. That doesn't happen. God gives him a promise. And Abraham acts according to belief in that promise, and it is reckoned to him as faith. It is reckoned to him as righteousness. So, kind of in closing, Abraham is good and bad at different times. And I'm trying to present him in a balanced, the way that I think the scriptures present him. That even though he has failures of faith, he's still a great man of faith. And if there were no failures of faith, what hope would normal people have in the story of Abraham? If Abraham never messed up, if he was perfect, and that's who God wants, is perfect people, then we don't even have to show up, do we? But there's no place in the kingdom for flawed people. If only perfect people could come here, Alma would be sitting here alone. That would be it. It's not good for Alma to be alone. You know, we need Alma to bless us, and we need to bless Alma. So that's Abraham. He's back and forth, but he's in the land at this point when he's making these good choices and good decisions and living out faith. He trusts in God to give him his daily bread. And all of this hoarding that we do, all of this panic out of perception of scarcity, ultimately, whatever it is, whether it's how we drive in traffic, whether it's how we carve out our spot at the airport, whatever it is. I fly Southwest all the time. You don't get your seat reserved when you fly Southwest. You board, I don't know how many of y'all have flown Southwest very much, but you board and you get whatever open seat you want. So everybody wants to board first. Boy, you used to, it's a little more ordinary now, but it used to be people would stand in line to get on the plane 2 or 3 hours before the plane landed. It's not even here yet. It's still over Iowa, you know, and you're standing in line so you could get on the plane, just so you could get on one of the lousy airplane seats. It's not just about how we act when we really are in lack. It's how we act when we perceive scarcity, when we perceive need. And to that, the gospel message is, the Lord will supply, the Lord will provide. He will give you every day your daily bread. Some people don't experience that. That's no fault of theirs. It's not a lack of faith. God's will is not always done on earth as it is in heaven. But that's the message. And we can perceive scarcity even in abundance. Surrounded by abundance, surrounded by all the Thanksgiving leftovers, we may think, I don't have enough storage containers for all this. You know, there's always something. Okay. Does anybody have the closing prayer assigned, or Mark, you want to lead us in a closing prayer?
Father in heaven, we're thankful to thee again for the time of worship, for the time of study of your word.